Did you know that there's one fire move that cannot thaw out frozen Pokémon? Or that we've been catching Pokémon the wrong way? Pokémon Gen 1 mechanics are insane. You wouldn't believe the complexity, but also mistakes and oversights that Game Freak left in some of the most influential video games ever. In this Iceberg, we'll take a look at the crazy mechanics, unexpected behaviors, and many things that went out of control in Pokémon Red, Blue and Yellow, as well as in Pokémon Stadium. Welcome to the Gen 1 Pokémon Mechanics Iceberg.
Say my name, EisenBerg. You're goddamn right.
Fire Spin doesn't thaw out frozen Pokémon. If your Pokémon gets frozen in Gen 1, it was synonym with losing, unless the opponent had the amazing idea of attacking you with a fire move. Many of you know that fire moves can actually thaw out a frozen Pokémon, but there's one that doesn't have this property, and that is Fire Spin. I don't know why, but it's not enough for fire moves to thaw out frozen Pokémon. They also require the property of being able to burn the opponent, such as Ember, Flamethrower, and Fire Blast. In Gen 2, Tree Attack had a 30% chance of thawing out a frozen opponent, but I'll talk more about this move in the Gen 2 Pokémon Mechanics Iceberg. Type effectiveness changes. If you have a Gengar with Shadow Ball, you may have an advantage against Psychic Pokémon, especially if your Pokémon is faster. This doesn't apply for Red, Blue and Yellow though. Ghost types were intended to be super effective against Psychic Pokémon as it is now, but if you had access to Lick, the only Ghost type attack in the entire game that inflicts direct damage, you would notice that it will never hit the target. Red, Blue and Yellow are programmed this way, but even back then, a lot of evidence suggests that Ghost types were supposed to have an advantage, as stated in the anime when Ash catches a hunter to beat Sabrina. In fact, in the Saffron Gym, there's a trainer that mentions that Psychic-type Pokémon only fear bugs and ghosts, at least in Red and Blue, because this reference was removed in Pokémon Yellow. As I said in my original Red, Blue and Yellow Iceberg, Psychic Pokémon were like some sort of boss due to their complete immunity to ghost attacks, as well as the lack of effective bug moves and Pokémon of this type. Another thing that doesn't happen anymore is that bug attacks were super effective against poison Pokémon and vice versa. I didn't notice this back then, probably because I never really had poison or bug Pokémon in my party. We know that ice melts close to fire, but in Gen 1, ice was neutrally effective against fire, something that was corrected from Gen 2 onward. This fact made both Charizard and Moltres take super effective damage from ice moves due to their secondary flying type. Dragons didn't benefit from Stab. This is present in all generations, but I'm talking about it because it was introduced in Gen 1. Stab, or same type attack bonus, refers to the fact that a Pokémon will get a 50% damage boost if the move is the same type as the Pokémon. Not all moves get Stab though. For example, attacks that deal fixed damage, such as Dragon Rage, Nightshade, and Seismic Toss, didn't have this property. Talking about Dragon Rage, Dragon was the only type in Gen 1 that didn't have a move that benefited from Stab. Critical hits ignore stat modifiers. We know that critical hits are broken in Gen 1 because they're tied to the user's speed, but there's an additional issue that has to do with stat drops and boosts. Nowadays, if a critical hit takes place, the damage calculation will be based on the current stat stage of the Pokémon, meaning that if a Pokémon uses Sword Stance, it will take that boost for the critical hit into account, and the same goes if the Pokémon stats are decreased. However, this is Gen 1 we're talking about, so critical hits only use the user's base stat, ignoring any modifiers. Focus energy quarters your critical hit ratio. If you want to do your opponent a favor, all you need is to use focus energy, because instead of doubling your critical hit ratio as intended, the game quarters it. Thankfully, Pokémon Stadium fixed this. Twin Needle's secondary effect. This is one of those moves I was never too familiar with, mainly because I usually pick Caterpie over Weedle thanks to Butterfree learning Sleep Powder and Confusion. Twin Needle is Beedrill's signature move, and as expected, is a bug type move. Because of that, I never expected it to have a secondary effect, and maybe I'm one of the few who didn't know this, but the second hit of Twinneedle actually has a 20% chance to poison the target. In Gen 2, Twinneedle has a very interesting effect on a specific type of Pokemon, but I'll talk about it in my Gen 2 Pokemon Mechanics Iceberg. Binding moves. How is it that a normal move with 85% accuracy and a power of only 15 can be so broken? Well, nowadays, Wrap is a move that you would never see in any competitive battle, but back in Red, Blue and Yellow, this infamous move, alongside Fire Spin, Clamp and Bind, were a complete nightmare, especially if you were facing fast Pokemon. Although these moves don't have perfect accuracy, once they connect, the opponent will be completely unable to make a move, and they have a 37.5% chance to connect for 2 turns, a 37.5% to connect for 3 turns, 12.5% for 4 turns, and 12.5% for 5 turns. As I said before, if the user is a fast Pokemon, the opponent will be completely helpless unless the move fails or if they switch out. One-hit KO moves deal 65,535 HP of damage. We know one-hit KO moves. If they connect, the opponent is guaranteed to faint, at least in Gen 1. In order to achieve this, the Gen 1 games use 16-bit values for calculating damage. For example, one-hit KO moves are programmed to deal exactly 65,535 HP of damage if they connect. Since there's no higher value than this, moves such as Fissure and Horn Drill guarantee that the opponent is defeated. In addition, the game is programmed so that if the user's speed is lower than the opponent's, the move will always fail. It's worth noting that in spite of being one-hit KO moves, they are still subject to type effectiveness or immunities, meaning that if you try to use Fissure against a flying Pokemon, no matter what, the move will always fail. Multistrike moves and critical hits. Nowadays, multi-strike moves such as Fury Swipes have a chance of landing a critical hit per strike. If you happen to land a critical hit with Fury Swipes in the first turn in Red, Blue and Yellow, every consecutive hit inflicts the same damage as a critical hit. This would often be lethal against an opponent because Fury Swipes has a power of 18, and if we multiply that by 5, which is the maximum number of times the move can hit, and then by 2 for a critical hit, this multi-strike move would have a power of 180, 30 points stronger than a Hyper Beam. Psywave. We know that the Psychic type was completely broken in Gen 1, but Psywave is far from being effective as it works in a really strange way. In fact, Psywave is the only move, at least in Generation 1, that can inflict 0 damage only when used by an opponent, an event that can desynchronize a Link battle. Normally, Psywave would inflict a random amount of damage that ranges between 1 HP and 1.5 times the user's level when used by the player. As you may expect from Psywave's randomness, this is a move that you don't want for any of your Psychic Pokemon, or Pokemon in general for that matter. In Gen 6 and 7, they improved its accuracy from 80 to 100, but from Sword and Shield onward, the move can't be selected. Burn Oddities. A burned Pokemon takes 116 damage of its max HP each turn and also gets its attack cut in half. However, there are a couple of problems with this status condition. First of all, while using an item to heal it, it will stop the Pokemon from taking damage, but its attack will remain halved. On the other hand, if a burned Pokemon uses Sword Stance, not only will its attack go back to normal, but it will also double it during the same turn while still taking damage from its status condition. Paralysis Oddities. Paralyzing an opponent is always a potential game changer, not only due to the fact that it reduces the opponent's speed, but also because the affected Pokemon may lose a turn. From Generation 9 onward, a paralyzed Pokemon's speed is reduced by 50%, but in Gen 1 this percentage goes as high as 75%. However, there's a way not only to revert the speed loss due to paralysis, but also to double the affected Pokemon's original speed, and this is by using the move Agility. although the 25% chance of losing your turn still remains. Another weird occurrence is that even if your Pokémon is cured of paralysis by using rest or an item, the Pokémon's reduced speed will persist. Gen 1 miss in Pokémon Stadium. Pokémon Stadium is known for having fixed a lot of the issues present in the handheld games, and the same happened with the infamous Gen 1 miss, kind of. A Gen 1 miss refers to the possibility of a 100% move to fail. This occurrence has a 1 in 256 chance of happening because the game generates a random number between 0 and 255, the formula intended for the move to miss if the number was higher than 255, something impossible, but instead, if said number is higher or equal to 255. This means that if the game happens to generate the number 255, the move will miss. In Pokémon Stadium, they partially address this issue because if the random number is 255, the game will reroll said number to decrease the chances of happening again, something unlikely but not impossible. If for some unfortunate reason that reroll yields another 255, a 100% accuracy move will fail in Pokémon Stadium, an occurrence that has a 1 in 65,536 chance of happening. Self-destruct and explosion have the opponent's defense. Explosion and self-destruct are some of the most powerful moves in the entire franchise. Before Gen 5, these moves used to have the opponent's defense, making this move's power twice as powerful as the real base power. This means that, for example, since Explosion is a 170 base power move, in reality it inflicts damage with a base power of 340. This becomes even more brutal in Gold, Silver and Crystal, as this move's power was increased from 170 to 250, and as a consequence, it became a move with a base power of 500. Struggle is a normal type attack. Struggle isn't a move per se, because it's not something you can select from your Pokémon's moveset. In fact, this can only be used when the Pokémon's power points are depleted. In recent generations, no matter what type the opponent is, Struggle will always deal neutral damage. However, in Gen 1, Struggle is considered a normal move, meaning that this attack is not very effective against rock Pokémon, is completely ineffective against ghost types, and in fact, normal Pokémon get stabbed from using it. Mega Punch is a highly accurate move. Mega Punch is a decent normal move that a lot of Pokémon can learn, and as far as I remember, you can get it quite early during your adventure. On top of that, did you know that it's also a highly accurate move? But how can a move that is 85% accurate be highly accurate? Well, maybe if we compare it to Mega Kick that is only 75% accurate, we can say that Mega Punch is highly accurate. This all originates in a not highly accurate description of Mega Punch in Pokémon Stadium that describes it as a highly accurate and relatively powerful move. Sleep is dead being shy. While being frozen is the worst thing that can happen to a Pokémon in the first Pokémon games besides fainting, sleep is without a doubt the second. Sleep can leave your Pokémon completely defenseless for 1 to 7 turns, time enough to be destroyed by your opponent, or boost their Pokémon stats to deal with the rest of your team. You might think that, since your Pokémon can be asleep for 7 turns, it'll wake up in the 7th turn, but this is not the case in Gen 1, because waking up takes a whole turn. That means that, in the worst possible scenario, a Pokémon can get the chance to attack on turn 8, but only if your Pokémon is faster than the sleep-inducing Pokémon. Thankfully, these moves are not necessarily the most accurate, with the exception of Spore that has an accuracy of 100 and that in Gen 1 could be only used by Paras and Parasect, very slow Pokémon. Fury Swipe's base power is not a multiple of 5. This entry refers to the fact that, out of the 920 moves until Generation 9, only 3 had a base power that wasn't a multiple of 5. The moves in question are Fury Swipes, Comet Punch and Pin Missile. The first two have a base power of 18 up to this day, and Pin Missile used to have 14, but this changed in Gen 6 when it became a 25 base power multi-strike attack. Growth equals a calm mind. Growth is essential in life, and it leads to a calm mind. That's what I would say if this weren't a Pokemon Iceberg. A lot of you may know that the special stat combined what we now know as special attack and special defense. This means that using an X special or growth in Gen 1 had the same effect as using Calm Mind in Gen 3 and onward, because this move increases both special attack and special defense by 1 stage. If this isn't broken enough, Amnesia, a move that boosts special by 2 stages, is the same as using Calm Mind twice in the same turn. On top of this, excellent Pokemon back in the day such as Slowbro and Mewtwo had access to this move, psychic Pokemon that dominated the competitive scene until Dark and Steel were introduced in Gold, Silver and Crystal. High Jump Kick's Crash Damage. High Jump Kick was probably the best fighting type move in Gen 1, considering that the best next thing was Submission, an attack with recoil damage. This fighting move can be quite risky in newer generations, because if it fails, the user will take damage equal to half the target's max HP. However, in Generation 1, the user only takes 1 HP of damage if it misses. According to Bulbapedia, crash damage doesn't take place if the attack misses a ghost Pokemon, but I tried this in Red, Blue and Yellow, as well as in Pokémon Stadium, and the user does take damage. It's worth noting that High Jump Kick received a significant buff, given that in Gen 1 it has a base power of 85, but in Gen 4 it increased to 100, and from Gen 4 onward it became a 130 power attack. No recoil damage in Pokémon Stadium. There are risky moves such as Takedown and Double Edge that deal recoil damage to the user. For example, the latter deals 1/4 of the total damage dealt to the opponent. However, this kind of moves are more effective in Pokémon Stadium because if you knock out an opponent with one of them, your Pokémon won't take recoil damage. This is very similar to the fact that Hyper Beam doesn't need to recharge provided you defeat the opponent, but only in Red, Blue and Yellow, because whether you miss or not, your Pokémon will need to recharge. Issues before the physical special split. A big chunk of the imbalance that the first gen suffered was due to how certain types could only inflict physical or special damage. For example, normal was always physical, regardless if the move was Hyper Beam or another that didn't make direct contact with the opponent. It wasn't until Gen 4 that Game Freak gave each move the ability to deal physical or special damage based on whether the move made contact with the opponent and not on the type. Being a water Pokemon like Gyarados wasn't the best thing ever because your attack was high, but you couldn't use it through water type moves to get stab. Instead, you had to rely on risky attacks such as Hyper Beam or settle for Surf or Hydro Pump to get stab. Besides Gyarados, Pokemon like Kingler, Arcanine and Flareon had to wait until Generation 4 for things to improve. Switching out while badly poisoned is beneficial. Unlike other status conditions, poison can make Pokemon poisoned or badly poisoned. A poisoned Pokemon takes a fixed amount of damage, while a badly poisoned Pokemon takes increasing damage, doubling the previous turn's poison damage. This means that no matter if you use Recover, for example, your Pokemon is destined to faint because Recover can't keep up with the increasing damage. However, due to an oversight, if you switch out a badly poisoned Pokemon and then switch it in, the Pokemon's bad poison will go away. Never-ending Transform Battle. Transform is Ditto's signature move, and as its name states, the user can copy the appearance of the opponent, as well as their moves and stats, with the exception of HP and the opponent's level. There's a situation involving this move that can make a battle impossible to win. If the only Pokemon battling are two Ditto or Mew that only know Transform, the battle will never end, because every time they use it, their power points will be restored. This doesn't happen in future generations, as if a Pokemon tries to transform into another one after having transformed, the move will fail. Mimic copies moves at random. In Gen 1, Mimic was able to copy any of the opponent's moves through a menu, but only when the player is battling an NPC or a wild Pokemon. During Link battles, Mimic can be used, but instead of selecting any of your opponent's moves, the selection will be at random. This makes a lot of sense from a competitive point of view, as you don't want the other player to see your Pokemon's moveset. Earthquake doesn't hit diggers. I know Game Freak fixed this in Gen 2, but considering that earthquakes occur underground, it was always strange to see a Pokémon go completely unharmed while using Dig. New mechanics in Gen 2 make certain situations in battle make more sense, such as the case when thunder hits Pokémon in the sky when it's raining. Now that I think about it, moves such as Surf should actually damage Pokémon who are underground. It was weird to see Surf failing against a Pokémon underground when the animation showed the water getting into the hole. In fact, Surf and Whirlpool can hit diving Pokémon from Gen 3 onward and inflict double damage, so it would make sense that Pokémon underground were susceptible to this as well. Substitute can knock you out. Substitute uses a quarter of the user's max HP and creates this Rhydon-like decoy that takes damage instead of the Pokémon. Also, it protects it from status problems. If the attack was meant to inflict more than 25% the max HP of the Substitute user, the decoy will break and the Pokémon will go back to normal. In Gen 1, using Substitute at exactly 25% the user's max HP was fatal because the game didn't prevent you from using it as in current generations. It was basically a self-destruct button without a destruction. Your Pokémon would just faint and that's it. I wasn't aware of this when I was making my Gen 1 Pokémon glitches Iceberg, but if the opponent uses Substitute in red, blue and yellow, when you open the battle menu, close it, and check any of your Pokémon status and go back to the battle, the enemy will become a broken version of that very Pokémon. This also works if the enemy uses Minimize. Dig's base power in Gen 1. I had no idea about this because a move's base power is not shown anywhere in the first generations of Pokémon games, but did you know that the move Dig, which in recent generations has a base power of 80, had a base power of 100 in red, blue and yellow? This means that in these games, Dig was as powerful as Earthquake. Lick can paralyze ghost Pokémon. Lick is a very weak attack and the only ghost move that can inflict direct damage, but besides that, it has a 30% chance to paralyze the opponent, and even electric Pokémon that were susceptible to this status problem until Generation 6 came out. However, for some bizarre reason, the only type that Lick can paralyze besides psychic Pokémon, because they were immune to ghost attacks in Gen 1, is the ghost type itself. This was fixed in Generation 2. Unused experience groups. Not all Pokémon are equal when it comes to experience. Some can take a really long time to level up, such as a Viper in Gen 3, while others take less than half the experience a legendary Pokémon needs to get to level 100. The experience groups in Red, Blue and Yellow are as follows: Slow with 1,250,000 points, Medium Slow with 1,059,860, Medium Fast with 1 million, and Fast with 800,000. However, in the game's data, there are two groups that exist in Gen 1 but that went unused. The slightly fast group with 849,970 experience points and the slightly slow with 949,930. The experience required to reach level 100 for these groups feels a bit random. Which Pokémon were supposed to belong to this group remains a mystery. Swift can miss. Swift is a very unique move in that it bypasses accuracy checks in order to always connect the opponent. In fact, it's so accurate that even if a Pokémon is in the sky or underground with +6 evasion, Swift will always hit the opponent even if the user has -6 in accuracy. However, there's a way in which Swift can miss, but this only happens in the Japanese version of the Gen 1 games. Due to an oversight, Swift is a 100% accuracy move, meaning that on top of being affected by accuracy and evasion modifiers, it is susceptible to the infamous Gen 1 miss, meaning that Swift has a 1 in 256 chance of missing. Since it doesn't bypass accuracy checks, the move fails if it's used against a Pokémon using Fly or Dig. Nonetheless, Swift actually bypasses accuracy checks in the Japanese version of the Gen 1 games, but only if the Pokémon is a substitute. Why? I have no idea. Batch Boost. The batch boost refers to the 12.5% boost in attack, defense, speed, and special your Pokémon gets from defeating Brock, Lieutenant Surge, Koga, and Blaine respectively. This is not reflected in your Pokémon stats, but it's applied when you enter a battle. I'm gonna use the example I used in my Gen 1 glitch as Iceberg. Let's say you have a Mew with 100 in all stats except for HP. Once it's in a battle, its stats will go from 100 to 112 thanks to the batch boost. Now, if Mew uses Defense Curl, a move that increases defense 1.5 times or 50%, its defense would go from 112 to 168. That's a perfectly intended mechanic. Nonetheless, due to an oversight or a programming error, when Mew stats are modified, the batch boost takes effect once more for all its stats except for HP. This is what is known as the batch boost glitch. This means that after a defense curl, instead of Mew having 112 in attack, speed and special, and 168 in defense, this mythical Pokémon will end up with 126 attack, speed and special, and 189 in defense. This happens regardless if your stats are boosted or dropped, as the batch boost will take place and apply the formula to your current stats. Masterball catch rate. We know that Gen 1 is flawed. For example, moves that have an accuracy of 100 still have a chance of missing because of a flawed formula that gives them a 1 in 256 chance of missing. Taking this into account, a lot of people spread the rumor that the Master Ball has the same chance to fail. This is not true because the Gen 1 miss formula only applies to moves. The catch formula is completely different for Pokeballs, but what's more, the Master Ball actually bypasses it, in the same way that Swift bypasses accuracy checks. I think that the only way in which a Master Ball can fail is if you try to catch Ghost or Marowak in Lavender Town, but I guess this happens because these creatures don't possess wild Pokémon data. Tall grass mechanics. If you played any of the Pokémon Core Series games, you may know that some Pokémon are less common than others. We have some like Dragonair with a 1% encounter rate in Pokémon Yellow, or Magikarp with a 100% when using the Old Rod. But what about tall grass or caves? What are the chances of encountering wild Pokémon once you step on a tile that contains wild encounters? It depends on the area. For example, when you surf on water, each tile has a 5 in 256 chance to generate a wild encounter, while walking on grass tiles has a 15 to 25 in 256 probability. This is precisely why the player encounters less wild Pokémon by surfing than on caves or tall grass. In fact, it makes sense that the likelihood is less because tall grass is only present in certain areas of a route, while an entire route can be composed of only water tiles. Talking about this, I spoke about one of the most unlikely things that's ever happened in a Pokémon game in my rare occurrences Iceberg, and it has to do with tall grass in the Safari Zone. A speedrunner called Shenanigan Smash was walking on tall grass and went 230 steps without encountering a single wild Pokémon. If the chance of encountering Pokémon in tall grass in the Safari Zone is 30 in 256, that means that the chance to go without any wild encounters in the Safari Zone for 230 steps on tall grass is around 1 in 3.1 trillion. When it comes to fishing, the chance to encounter a Pokémon will depend on the type of rod you're using. The old rod has a 100% chance, the good rod 66.6%, and the super rod 50%. Damage roll. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you can defeat a Pokémon with, for example, a single Psychic, but when you fight the exact same opponent again and use the same move, it survives with a pixel of its HP? That happens because the damage a Pokémon deals, even under the same circumstances, is not always the same. Actually, the game takes several elements of both Pokémon into account to determine part of the final damage. For example, level, attack, defense, special, which also functions functions as special defense in Gen 1, move base power, same type attack bonus, type effectiveness, critical hits, and stat modifiers. Let's say a Mewtwo with 406 special uses Psychic on a level 100 Articuno with 348 special. Instead of always dealing the exact same amount of damage, the game generates a random value within a fixed range, which determines the exact HP deducted from the target Pokémon. This is known as a damage roll. In this case, Articuno will lose between 113 and 133 HP. This is why sometimes a Pokémon goes down in a single hit, and other times it survives with barely any energy. Safari Zone mechanics. The Safari Zone works slightly different than regular wild battles because instead of having a normal battle with a Pokémon, you have a chance to throw a rock, throw bait, and throw a Pokeball. This Pokeball is a Safari Ball, and you might think that it works differently from other Pokeballs, but in fact this is an Ultra Ball in disguise. Ultra Balls underperform when used against high catch rate Pokémon such as Magikarp. This has to do with Pokeballs generating a random number between 0 and 250, while Ultra Balls only generate one between 0 and 150. While a Pokemon's catch rate is not the only variable taken into account to determine if a Pokemon is caught or not, the Ultra Ball has, for example, a 28.4% chance of catching a Magikarp at full HP, while a Pokeball a 34.9% chance. What about Pokemon with a lower catch rate? Well, there's a problem too. Each Pokemon in the Safari Zone has a chance of fleeing. This is determined by a formula that takes the Pokemon's current speed and multiplies it by 2. Then the game generates a random number between 0 and 255 on each turn and compares it to the latter. If the Pokemon's speed is equal to or higher than the random number, the Pokemon flees. This gets even worse if the fast Pokemon is at a higher level, as naturally their speed is higher than the same Pokemon at a lower level. This means that Safari Zone exclusive Pokemon such as Scyther and Tauros are very likely to flee. You could reduce the chances of this Pokemon fleeing by throwing bait, but at the same time you're having their catch rate, and therefore increasing the difficulty to catch them. If you want to increase your chances of catching it, throw a rock. This will double its catch rate, but it will make it more likely to flee. It's worth noting that a Pokemon's catch rate is not the only element that determines if it's caught or not, meaning that if you double a Pokemon's catch rate, it doesn't mean it's twice as easy to catch. We'll see this later on. Stat overflow. An overflow happens when a value is too large to be stored in the amount of memory allocated for its data type and goes back to a low value. In the case of stats in Pokémon Red, Blue, and Yellow, this number is 1024. Although no Pokémon can reach this number on its own, with the aid of items or stat increasing moves, a Pokémon like Mewtwo can exceed this limit and get, for example, its special to a number as low as 5. As far as I could understand, the game has a way to prevent this by stopping the Pokémon at 999, but if a Pokémon with this number gets that stat dropped by one stage, the game won't be able to prevent an overflow. This is a way in which a level 58 Porygon can beat a level 100 Mewtwo with a single Psychic. If you want to learn more about this, watch this video by Crystal. Pokeball mechanics. Pokeballs are some of the most iconic elements of the Pokémon franchise, and you may think that the formula they use to determine if a Pokémon is caught or escapes are simple, but you couldn't be farther from the truth. The Masterball is simple though because, as I explained before, it bypasses the catch formula, making it infallible. However, when it comes to the rest of the Pokeballs, things can get a bit trickier. Let's take a look at how catching Pokémon works. The capture process is handled in several steps, and the Pokémon is only caught if it successfully passes each one. First of all, the game will generate a random number depending on what Pokeball you throw. With Pokeballs, the number ranges from 0 to 255, with Great Balls from 0 to 200, and with Ultra Balls from 0 to 150. The first step has to do with the Pokémon status condition. The Pokémon will be caught immediately if it is asleep or frozen, and the random number the Pokeball generates is less than 25, 5, or less than 12 if it's burned, paralyzed, or poisoned. These numbers are known as the status threshold. If the number does not result in an instant catch, the game moves on to step 2. Here it subtracts the status threshold from that number and compares the result to the Pokemon's catch rate. For Mewtwo, whose catch rate is only 3, almost any number causes it to break free immediately. Only extremely low rolls allow the game to continue to the next check. If it does continue, a new random number between 0 and 255 is generated. Let's call this number M. Next, the game calculates a value using the Pokemon's max HP multiplied by 255 and then by 4, and divides that by the Pokemon's current HP multiplied by the ball modifier. Let's call this value F. Now let's say that Mewtwo has a maximum HP of 243, its current HP is 50, and an Ultra Ball is used. Solving the formula gives a result of 413, but since F is capped at 255, the final value becomes 255. If F is greater than or equal to M, the Pokemon is caught. And to think that as a kid I thought that pressing down and B was all I needed to successfully catch Pokemon. Thank you so much for watching. If you love icebergs and video games, please go check the EisenBerg Experience, my other channel where I talk about video game icebergs. So far I've spoken about Super Mario, Star Fox, F-Zero, Street Fighter, Perfect Dark, Stellar Blade, Resident Evil, and Shadow Man. But I'm planning on making more icebergs, so if you're interested, please subscribe to both channels. Also, I have a series of videos on how to become a PokeTuber, so if you want, consider becoming a member of the channel for a couple of dollars. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I'll see you in 2026.